Alright, so now as we have already talked about that how to handle state in React, what is state and how it works. Now let's see that if you want to handle multiple states in one single component, how can you do it, right? So let's take this counter a little forward. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to set a factor for this counter, right? So basically if I set my factor to 4, right? So what will happen if I set my factor to 4? So my decrement and my increment value will be incremented by 4 and decremented by 4. Similarly, if I set it to 6, so it will be incremented by 6 and decremented by 6, like that, right? So basically the factor I'm going to set that with what factor I want the increment or decrement to happen. But I cannot do it manually like this, right? One by one I cannot change these values. I want to change it through my app. I want it to be dynamic again. So what I can do is I can maintain a factors state as well, right? So I'll just keep it like that, count plus 1, count minus 1. And now what I will do is I'll just make a state for the factor, right? So I'll just say const factor, and over here I'll just say set factor. Again, the set factor will be a method. Over here I'll just use the use state, so it will give me the access to the state. And as an initializer, as an initialized value, I'll just have 1 over here. The default value is 1. So now what I will do is I'll not use 1 over here. I'll just use the what? Factor value over here. So I can just write it like this, const factor and factor, something like that, right? So now what will happen that this factor value will be used to set my count. So if I go over here and if I increment this is still working fine because we have added 1, right? But decrement is, okay, this should be minus, right? Yes, count minus factor. Great, let's refresh everything. And now let's do this incrementing by 1, decrementing by 1. Okay, so now what I want to set is I want to set my factor through my app as well. So over here I'll just have an h1 again. I want to set my factor to factor. Right, something like that. So now what I want to do is I want to set my factor from here as well, and again I'll have these two buttons for my factor, right, for my factor. So what I'm going to do over here is I want to set my factor dynamically. So suppose now my factor is 1 over here, and now I want to set this factor to some other value. So what I can do is I can just have these two particular functions again. I can write them again, right? But this time I'll just write increment factor, decrement factor, like that. So let's have these two functions again. I'll just need the same definition. So over here, what I will do is I'll just change this function to increment factor and this to decrement factor, something like that, right? I'll just format it for you once. Great. So now increment factor and decrement factor, how they should work. So now here I'll just add factor plus 1 and factor minus 1. Great. And this should be increment factor and this should be decrement factor, something like that. So what I'm going to do over here is what I am going to teach you with this particular example is that whenever I'll increase this factor, you see this factor will increase, right? I guess this is attached to the count only. Increment factor and decrement factor, the value is going to be factor over here. Okay, we haven't set the factor, we are setting the count. We need to do set factor. All right. Right. So now we are going to just set the factor. So if I just refresh everything and I go over here and if I set my factor increment, so now my factor is set to 5. So if my factor is now set to 5, so what this factor's value will become? Because it's updating the state, so it will become 5. So now what will happen? My count will start incrementing with 5 and decrementing with 5, right? Like that. So let's increment. Now you see directly 5, 10, 15, 20, 15, 10, 5, like that, right? And if I just decrement my factor to 2, so now what will happen? It will start incrementing by 2 and decrementing by 2, like that. So you see, you can set your factor and you can make your own counter as well, that how what should be the first the factor of my count and how my counter should work, right? So by default it is 1. You can actually set this to 10, or let's set this to 25, right? Let's set the factor to 25. So what will happen, this will now get let's set this to 25, yes, like that. And let's increment this, so 30, 55, 80, 105, like that, right? So basically you can create your own set of factors and you can play around with this, right? So by this, what we have learned is that in a state, in a particular component, you can handle multiple states as well. So over here we can handle two states. One is to set our factor, one is to set our count, right? So to set our count, we are using a factor, and to set our factor, we are using the increment factor decrement factor method, right? We're using this set factor to set the factor, we are using set count to set the count, and this is how we are writing this particular logic, right? So this is how you can handle multiple states in a component.